Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's April 23rd, 2021 program. Oregon Legislature tackles equity in policing. Please note that this program was recorded before a verdict was rendered in the Derek Chauvin case, so the implications of that decision will not be discussed. This is the 30th program of our 2020-2021 programming year. My name is Scott Coltrane, and I'm the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, and our broadcast on public radio station KLCC 89.7 on Mondays at 7 p.m. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors, Kaiser Permanente, University of Oregon, Peace Health, and Lane Community College, as well as receiving generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. In today's program, we welcome Oregon's House District 11 State Representative Marty Wilde, Sean Shivers, and Michael Haynes-Garcia. Marty Wilde was first elected to represent Oregon's House District 11 in 2018. He is currently a member of the House Committee on Equitable Policing. Sean Shivers has served on the Eugene Police Commission since 2017 and has been chair since 2018. Michael Haynes-Garcia is a Eugene Police Commissioner and a member of the city's Civilian Review Board. He was a professor at the University of Oregon from 2005 to 2021 and was recently appointed to the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin. Biographical information on our speakers is available on our website. I would like to thank Mary Layton for coordinating today's program and Joel Corin for moderating. In the wake of demonstrations demanding critical examination of criminal justice systems and more even-handed enforcement of laws, the Oregon Legislature is currently considering 21 bills to begin the work of improvement. The Committee on Equitable Policing, a subcommittee of the House Committee on Judiciary, is deliberating these bills. Representative Marty Wilde will review the content of the bills and give an update on their status as of mid-April. Sean Shivers and Michael Haynes-Garcia will discuss the extent to which the bills address the problems of greatest concern. Our format today includes a question and answer period via Zoom.
Hello, I'm Joel Corin, from the Program Committee of the City Club of Eugene. Welcome to our program. Our first speaker will be Representative Marty Wilde. Marty?
Thank you, Joel. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me back to City Club. It's always a pleasure to come back. And it's an honor to serve on the Equitable Policing Subcommittee in the state legislature. I'd like to especially thank Senator James Manning and Representative Janelle Bynum for their work. First, I'd like to acknowledge a few truths about our work. Racial minorities have been disproportionately the victims when police use excessive force. The police have been used to enforce a caste system in our society in the past. But most police officers serve with good motivations and a desire to serve their communities. Also, no one likes being in a profession that tolerates the presence of people who don't live up to the values of that profession. I start with those values, and I'd like to tell you a little about the work we're doing in the legislature. We actually did a lot in two special sessions last year. In the first special session of 2020, last summer, we sort of made our first attempt to ban chokeholds. We established a duty to intervene when an officer witnesses misconduct by a fellow officer to the detriment of the public. We established a suspensions and revocations database through the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. That's our police licensing agency. We passed some limits on the use of tear gas and other indiscriminate munitions. And then we started some arbitration reforms as well for police discipline. In the second special session of 2020, we came back and added two additional concepts. We further limited the use of chokeholds by police and corrections officers, and we updated our use of force standards to comply with Supreme Court cases and required de-escalations and alternatives before the use of deadly force. These were the most significant updates to the use of force in 40 years, and I'm indebted to my colleagues for the work they put in on those. So I'd like to tell you a little about the work we're doing now in the 2021 legislative session. Really, our reforms run every from everything from hiring and training all the way through discipline and termination of officers and even compensating victims. When it comes to hiring and training, we are working on bills that will do better background checks to make sure that people with histories of racist behavior or associations with criminal or discriminatory groups are prohibited from joining the police. We also have a bill to improve training at DPSST for the officer basic course on bias crimes, making sure police understand and effectively investigate those crimes. We're also working on training on trauma-informed policing, making sure that police better appreciate the impacts of trauma on people that they're interacting with on a daily basis. Also in the initial training for officers, we're trying to make sure they get training on CPR and airways to make sure the police avoid injury as they take people into custody. There's a lot of operations reforms we've been working on as well, both in response to the circumstance with George Floyd, but also in response to the activities in Portland last summer. First, ensuring that uniforms, that officers are identifiable as police when they're performing crowd control duties, that they have a name or identifier so they can be reported if there's a problem. We found that anonymity breeds impunity, and it was important to be able to identify officers who were acting for the public. We are working on legislation also to limit the circumstances when in an assembly, a protest can be declared unlawful and be dispersed. You have First Amendment rights to assembly, and we wanted to make sure that the police weren't superseding those rights without a very solid reason. We've been working on doxing, anti-doxing legislation as well, preventing anyone from releasing the personal information of another person publicly with the intent of harassing them. That protects police, but it also protects members of the public who have been harassed and doxed by other people as well. We're clarifying a crime called interference with a peace officer. The police are not your boss. They should not and do not have the authority to order you to do anything except as necessary to enforce the law. Due to sort of a misunderstanding in drafting, the law ended up being that the police could order you to do certain things. And then if you didn't comply, it was a Class A misdemeanor. Well, while it may be appropriate in some circumstances, if you're violating the law, that's not appropriate in most circumstances where the police are not intended to be somehow superior in their rights in the public space. We are continuing our work on munitions and tear gas, eliminating indiscriminate weapons from police stores and limiting the use of force against people who have not violated the law. We are creating a database requiring the reporting and collection of use of force reports, both to identify officers who have problems, but also to identify circumstances under which force is used for the purpose of avoiding it in the future. There's really just not a good database of when officers are using force and how we might improve it so that they don't have to use as much force against the public. We are, along with Senator Wyden on the federal level, trying to extend the CAHOOTS model, funding non-police crisis assistance to avoid conflicts between mentally ill or houseless people and the police, who are frankly ill-equipped to address the needs that they have in the public space. And we've put limits on military surplus purchases, basically banning offensive weapons and armored vehicles from police inventories. I've certainly used those in my own military career, but they're not appropriate for a service whose function is to serve and protect. We're also doing a lot of work on discipline and accountability. We are continuing our work on arbitration to make sure that there is a faster, speedier process to hold officers accountable, but also to give them due process so that they, they are indeed have committed the offenses they're being disciplined for. We are also providing publicly available misconduct records through the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. That's continuing to improve transparencies when officers engage in misconduct. The current standard, currently in law, if they've had a suspension of their license, that is already public. We are also working to expand that so that anytime there's an economic consequence, like an officer's been suspended from duty, that will also be available. One of the bills I've been working on personally is the qualified immunity issue. We're limited in what we can do on that because it's largely a federal doctrine. So we've been trying to increase compensation available at the state level to provide fairer compensation to victims of official misconduct. And we are also working to enable a new police oversight body approved by the voters in Portland that passed by, I think, 82% were in favor of the new police oversight body. And so we want to make sure we're empowering that. I'd like to highlight one of the things that people are sometimes mistaken about is thinking that these bills are somehow controversial. Most of these bills passed out of committee unanimously, and those that have passed the chamber have done so by wide margins, usually about 3-1 in terms of the vote margins. A second, I want to point out that these measures run the gamut from police selection to termination. We really want to change the system in ways that will help the public from the start of an officer's career to the end of an officer's career. And finally, I guess I'd just like to highlight that none of this will make any difference unless you insist that it be implemented. The culture of any organization can take a long time to change. We can set the starting conditions and we can set the standards, but the legislature does not provide consistent ongoing oversight the way that you can through your police commission and your city council. We will rely on you to see it through. Thank you for inviting me here today, and I look forward to your questions after our other two speakers.
The next speaker will be Sean Shivers, who is chair of the Eugene Police Commission. Sean?
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, so thank you all for inviting me here and letting me speak before you. I really like some of the changes that Marty's been talking about. In Eugene, we have a lot of these things already implemented. The visible identifiers is a policy we looked at just last week. So for those who don't know, the Eugene Police Commission is a body of citizens appointed by City Council to look and review and make sure that police policy is always up to date and in line with community standards. The Police Commission is one part of the accountability ecosystem that Eugene has developed over the last few years. There's some things that can only happen at the legislature. Anything with public records law is not something that the Police Commission can deal much with. But for many of these issues, hiring, use of force, any policy or procedure, the Police Commission has the ability to review it and make recommendations directly to chief. So we are a proactive body that helps set up that culture, keep the policy updated year after year as we cycle through new commissioners. So there are 12 folks who serve on the board, or serve on the commission rather, from all across Eugene, from all sorts of, from every different walk of life. One of those members will be speaking next, Michael Haynes-Garcia, is a member of the CRB. So the Civilian Review Board, the CRB, is the second piece of the accountability network. They actually take a look at incidents when they arise and provide a spot check when a complaint goes to the auditor. The auditor for Eugene is something that every city should have, in my opinion, where folks can submit complaints and commendations. If an officer is so much as rude to you, you can submit a complaint to the auditor and have that go through the process, get to their supervisor, and help foster the kind of behavior we expect of our peace officers going forward. These don't have to be controversial, like Marty was saying. They don't have to be aggressive or punitive. They are a system and a method by which we ensure that behavior remains appropriate. And like any job, people have bad days, they speak out of turn, and we want to make sure that that's encouraged, that is discouraged. And the CRB, the auditor, are two parts of that. For the Police Commission, our job is to give those, in my opinion, a large part of our job is to give the tools to the CRB to actually make those judgment calls of when a complaint comes in, is this officer acting in a way that they knew they shouldn't have? And the police policy does two things. One, for the community, it provides a kind of security, knowing that certain behavior just isn't acceptable from our officers. For our officers, it provides a lot of clarity about what the community wants from them, what we expect from them, so that they don't unknowingly make a mistake. Now, Marty was talking about the bill before the legislature dealing with the egregious acts occasionally committed by officers. And obviously, I think there's an acknowledgement that not everybody who is a police officer should be a police officer. And for the commission, we luckily don't have to deal much with that. That is where the CRB will step in. That's where the auditor will step in and chief will step in. I am super excited because the police commission has our biannual work plan coming up. So every 2 years we get together, we create a work plan about what needs to be updated, what innovations, how can we improve on the system we've already got. That's a large part of why Eugene is always been ahead of the curve, going both at the statewide level and at the national level. There's a reason people look to us for programs like Cahoots, for things like body cameras. Springfield is just getting theirs now. And the work plan is a large part of that. So I encourage everyone listening to join us on May 15th at 1 p.m. On Zoom. You can go to the Eugene, if you just Google Police Commission, you can see when our next meeting will be. We'll be discussing what the community is concerned about. We will be creating a work plan that we put before City Council, and they will be approving, hopefully, that work plan, assuming we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's, to go forward for the next 2 years. These topics can be wide-ranging, and I'm super excited about the work we'll be doing. After the murder of George Floyd, we had a huge influx of community members interested in participating. It's the largest application process I've ever heard of for a city body. That includes 114 applications from community members from every corner of Eugene. And we have appointed five new commissioners to help us carry that work forward for the next couple of years. But we still need community participation, so please join us.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Roy Haynes-Garcia, who is on the Police Commission and also studies police activities and police conduct. Michael?
Hi, thank you for having me back. It's I think I was on the City Club about June or July of last year. So it's great to be back. And yeah, and this is an important topic, and I am very happy that the state legislature in Oregon is taking so many actions around not just policing reform, but also other aspects of the criminal justice system. So bail reform, et cetera. So I want to start by just giving you a sense of where I'm coming from. So I have taught about the criminal justice system for over 2 decades now. And the point that I always try and get my students to understand is that part of how we got into the fix we're in currently with 5% of the world's population and 1/4 of the world's prisoners, over 1,000 people killed by police annually. Part of how we got here was by a lot of good intentions. It's tempting for my students to want to think that this has all been caused by evildoers who wanted to oppress everyone, and there are some of those. But for the most part, a lot of the attempts at reforming the criminal justice system to make it more equitable, to make it more fair, more rational, more predictable, a lot of times those attempts at reform have unintended consequences. And so I have my students do a policy briefing at the end of the term, and I tell them a big part of how you're graded is going to be how well you anticipate possible unforeseen consequences, because that's sort of the bugbear in policy. And so it was interesting to me to look over some of the bills that are making their way through the legislature. And I see in some of the bills a similar kind of desire for what I call feel-good moves, or things that seem like they're going to be an easy fix. So, for example, with there's a bill or two related to oversight and police oversight, and what they essentially do is, to pick up on Sean's discussion, is allow for, or require even, I can't tell with the language, the creation of police commissions, or what Eugene's police commission does, which is bodies to review policy for police departments, which is undeniably important. But part of what Eugene has is, we have an auditor's office, which is independent. They receive complaints, they classify the complaints, they participate in the investigations, they make recommendations to the chief. The Civilian Review Board then can come in and review the work of the auditor. And so there's several different kinds of checks and balances. And one of the really important things is that there are civilians involved in the handling of complaints and the investigation of complaints. And so that's a really important element that I didn't see in the legislation that's working its way through. It's important for all the reasons that Sean described. I think that there's often a desire to fix what we think is wrong with policing by creating more training, by adding more technology, by creating more policies. And that's not, the evidence on that is mixed. It's not clear that body cameras reduce complaints against police or reduce use of force. There's studies that go different ways depending on what city you're looking at. One of the things I do think is really important is that Oregon seems to be moving in the direction of not just thinking about municipal police departments, but also county sheriff's departments. I think one of the things that guts me sometimes is that so much of there's so many complaints against sheriff's departments, particularly those sheriff's departments that run jails. And in Eugene, those complaints can't be routed through the police auditor, because the jail is under the jurisdiction of the county. So I think that finding some kind of way of catching those gaps in oversight is really important. And so I think that Portland, Salem, and Eugene are the only cities in the state that have some kind of police oversight, civilian police oversight. There was a great two-part series on Salem's in the Salem Reporter recently that I would recommend. They've essentially existed for a while and they don't hear any cases. I can't imagine not hearing any cases on the Eugene CRB, and it's not because our police department is terrible. It's because people know about the complaint process. They know that there's a police auditor. The auditor's office is located right downtown by the bus mall, so easy to access. There's a Spanish-speaking intake person who can receive those complaints. So it's not just about creating the mechanisms, it's also about making sure that they're accessible, making sure people are familiar with the process, that the process isn't too cumbersome for someone who, might have a middle school education and maybe has lots of trauma and maybe some substance abuse issues, maybe is homeless, right? There has to be ways to not just have the mechanisms in place, but also to make sure that they are working. So yeah, I think that's important. I think I've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to move on to another one of the things. Sorry, I wrote in an angle. I wasn't aware that Oregon is dealing with qualified immunity, but I think people are pretty familiar with that at this point. That is something to see what we can do about at the state level. I know that there's Supreme Court decisions and whatnot that play into that. I think also there's some disturbing bills making their way through the legislature, disturbing to me. So, for example, there are a couple that are requiring an increase in staffing for Oregon State police. And nothing against Oregon State Police. I know some of them, good guys, but I think part of the message that we've been receiving, and one of the things is, I think another really good bill that I saw working its way through transfers some of the responsibility for emergency response from the police to, I can't remember the acronym, but the Oregon Emergency Response, whatever they are. So if we begin to offload some of that kind of work, some of the work that's about everything from cats in trees to someone who's off their meds and walking down the street naked, right? If we can move those out of police bailiwick, then I don't know if we'll need to maintain the same levels or much less increase the levels of police in our society.
Our first question is from former Mayor Kitty Piercy.
Oh, thank you very much. This is for everybody. As mayor, one of the things that I was concerned about is, as you know, the City Council of Eugene cannot do anything with personnel issues. So they can't say anything about particular officer behaviors or anything of that sort. But they are supposed to be on top of policies that the city manager will implement. And I personally feel that one of the issues we have is they don't know how to fit into the policy making process so that they are really aware of their role of oversight of the police through the manager and from the manager through the chief. And so you may have some comments to say about this, all of the speakers, but I just think it's a very important role, because when I was there, even with I would not have known much of anything if I hadn't had my regular meetings with the auditor. But I wanted to say that really for the council to step up to do the role they are supposed to do within the confines of the law is something that they don't do it as consistently or as aggressively as I think they should on behalf of the public of Eugene.
Marty, do you want to start?
Of course. Well, thank you for the question, Madam Mayor. I guess I would say at the state level, what we're trying to do is make a more predictable arbitration process. So because police can't strike, that means there's an arbitration process if there's discipline and the officer disagrees with the discipline. Some of the problems with that process have been the way the arbitrators were selected, and often the time it took to get them done. So the bill 1604, which is the bill we passed last summer, required the negotiation of a disciplinary matrix at the local level to provide greater clarity for both the officer and management about, what, offense was worth how much, in essence. And then at the reforms we're working on right now would require that instead of the arbitrator being selected by the parties, the arbitrator would become from a panel of pre-qualified individuals, and that would be required to hear the case within a certain period of time and abide by the negotiated standards as well. So it also has what we call a reset on the precedent. So sometimes these arbitrators were relying on fairly old precedents to decline to impose appropriate discipline. I believe there's also a provision for what we call a public interest override regarding an officer remaining in employment if they've committed an act against the public interest that's been found to have happened. So that's the other piece of that. So I can't really speak to local electeds, although I was on the police commission and always appreciated having the liaison from the council there to sort of provide that perspective as well. But I certainly agree with you that we do rely on the city manager and the police chief to be good stewards for the public.
Sean?
Yeah, Sean Shivers here. I think the police commission has the biggest role in this direct sort of interface. As Marty mentioned, the police commission does have 2 city councilors who serve on it. Right now that's Jennifer Ye and Alan Zelinka. So obviously there are a lot of boards and commissions throughout the city. There's a lot of stuff for city councilors to pay attention to. Most only have one city council liaison. Police commission gets 2 because it is recognized as an area of particular sensitivity and importance. In addition to that, the city council has the ability to, of course, hire and fire the chief of police. So that's one of the difficulties with the ad hoc committee setup right now. Is the ad hoc committee on policing was established about a year ago to bring together folks from marginalized communities and talk a little bit about well, talk quite a lot actually about ways in which police can be improved, and their recommendations go directly to city council, and then city council can then direct either the police commission to take a second look at these or direct the chief of police to implement them. Sarah, the city manager, has been fairly responsive when questions I've had or concerns I've had about the process are concerned. But in addition to the liaisons from the city council, there's a lot of there are a lot of times that I am in front of city council sort of asking for permission to pursue a particular topic or giving a report on what we've done. So the work plan that I mentioned in the first half is one such time. So I'll be going before city council to talk about what we think would be a good avenue to address some of these more specific concerns. And, you know, they can't be as involved as we are. That's one of the reasons that the commission was created, of course, because it's recognized that it's important, and there's only so much time in the day.
The next question is from Andrew College.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you, panelists. I had the privilege of being the co-chair of the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing for several years. That was a body that grew out of a settlement agreement between Portland and the federal government. And one of our tasks was to try to not only dig into police policy, but also, to the extent that we could, rebuild trust between community and police. And that proved and has proven to be not only important, but elsewhere, a very difficult task. And so one thing that we tried as a committee, was to propose what amounted to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission model in Portland to dig into the history of police misconduct in that city and try to level with the past so that we can move forward sort of collectively on the future. We don't know if this will work. They're in the beginning stages of planning that, but I'm curious to hear your response to using that type of structure as part of the effort to a more equitable policing. And if you don't think that that's a good idea, what are some other strategies we might be able to use to grapple with the history so that we get to a better future? Appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
Who would like to start first on that?
Let's start with
Michael?
Yeah, Michael Haynes-Garcia here, and thank you for that question, Andrew. So Stockton, California is doing some great work around this right now. Their chief of police is essentially doing truth and reconciliation processes. They're holding meetings with police officers and community members to talk about the history of police involvement in basically disrupting poor communities and communities of color, and having those really difficult conversations between police and community members about racism, about inequality, and about the police department's historical role in that. It's really quite remarkable they're doing that. When I heard you say truth and reconciliation, you know, there are different models for that, and some are very formalized, very rich, very involved, very public. And I think those tend to be the ones that have the most effect. If it's simply a committee listening to focus groups, that's not going to achieve that. So to take the history of Eugene, for example, in 1997, under Kitty Piercy's predecessor, I believe, Mayor Jim Torrey, there was a Eugene, I can't remember what it stands for, but the AIRAC, which was another version of Eugene's current ad hoc committee. That was a committee that had a similar charge. It did all these like community listening sessions. It put together a wonderful report. But we're in the situation where we're doing it again. How that's 20 years later. And we can just keep repeating the process every 20 years. And that's why communities of color think that these committees, these processes are simply window dressing, because it feels that way if you have to do it over and over again and you're still not making ground. So yeah, so I guess that's sort of my thoughts on that. I don't know if that how well I address the question.
Yeah, Sean Shivers here. To address something specifically that you said, Michael, I don't think that doing it over and over again is necessarily a bad thing. The police commission is essentially set up to be a continuous example of that for policy. So the ad hoc committee, I don't think qualifies nearly, and not that you implied that it did, but it's certainly not a truth and reconciliation type endeavor. And the value of the ad hoc committee in helping the police commission do a large volume of these isn't necessarily at odds with that. Personally, I don't, to answer the question directly, I don't have a particular concerns about a truth and reconciliation style endeavor. And I was super happy to hear that Marty talking about the reset of precedent in some of these arbitrations, because that's been a huge issue of concern for the police commission. I will also say that the loss of trust is recursive. So the more trust you lose, the easier it is to lose more trust. And going back to what Michael said earlier about great ideas that haven't worked out super well necessarily, we can go directly to school resource officers. They were largely put into place in 21st century policing. The report by Obama's administration, there's a lot of justification for it in helping foster trust, introduce folks to police officers at a young enough age, help build those trusts, help get in sort of before kids develop bad relationships, and it'll be great for their trust, right? But then, of course, what we saw was not that at all. For a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think there is potential, if handled appropriately, to acknowledge some of the difficulties here. But, that's kind of outside of my qualifications, so I don't want to speak more on that specifically.
Marty, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I guess I would say when we saw Truth and Reconciliation, like in South Africa, it was only because there was a real threat of prosecution, right? For the people who had been offenders, they needed to see that there were going to be consequences. And so I saw that when I was serving in Bosnia as well. We were hunting down war criminals and bringing them to justice. And so without the threat of that, then there's often little incentive to engage in a process where of truth seeking. And I think that's important. I would say I have seen some promising developments in the Dante Wright shooting. For instance, the officer was not only, well, I guess she resigned, but was pretty quickly charged as well. And so we do have to see prosecutors stepping up to say, just because you have a badge and a gun, if you commit a crime, you're not going to be treated any differently. You're going to be prosecuted. and quickly. And I think once we start having that as the standard, then there will be more of an interest in examining some of these past incidents to say, look, in the light of hindsight, can we get to the truth of what happened there, and be honest about the circumstances in those historical cases. Thanks.
Michael, do you have another comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say really quickly that I think that the question of rebuilding trust is part of, so I hear often that trust never existed. And so it's not so much a question. I think one of the issues is that we tend to approach this as a matter of rebuilding trust, but it really has to start from the ground up with building trust. And I think that's where what Stockton is doing, that's where they're starting, is that there has never been trust. In fact, a colleague of mine at the University of San Diego did a survey with the Stockton Police Department and found that the levels of trust between officers, the level of trust for the community on the part of officers was lower than the level of trust among the community for police. So we're talking about a situation where in many cities, police don't trust the communities that they're policing. So that needs to be a conversation as well. I also think that this question of, I lost that train of thought. Never mind.
So Sean Shivers here again. The loss of trust, or the trust from police of the community, I think is right at the center of the discussion of community policing, right? Like we want to foster positive interactions between the officers and a community of which they see mostly the bad things. They are called to the worst incidents that our community sees. So I agree 100%. That needs to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mary Layton. There you are.
Yeah, I want to comment briefly on that last part of the conversation. It has occurred to me that my trust in law and order is a direct consequence of privilege. It never occurred to me as a Southside Chicago Irish girl that the Southside Chicago Irish cop would not help me out. And that sort of creates a foundation for trust. So I think we probably a lot of us underestimate the extent to which our reaction to policing is really the reflection of the privilege we've experienced one way or the other. But I have a question. I think it's for Marty, but anybody else could answer. When is a cop the boss, and when is he not the boss or she? Is there a bright line there in the thinking or the law? You mentioned that, and I thought, whoa, okay, now, how will I know? How will the cop know?
Well, thank you for the question. I guess when you're breaking the law, the cop's the boss. He does get to tell you to stop breaking the law, or she. And so when it comes to things like, traffic stop, yes, you're obligated to follow the directions of the officer during that. The problem we're running into is officers, especially when people were exercising their First Amendment rights, officers who didn't like the activity, but the activity was lawful. So the example we come up with, let's take one of the Portland situations where there's a large crowd of people who are exercising their right to protest. And then there are a few people who are engaging in arson. Now, under that circumstance, can the officer order you to go home and arrest you for failing to abide by that order? Well, no. On the other hand, if the officer is trying to get at the arsonist, can the officer tell you, hey, you need to get out of the way so I can get the arsonist? And are you obligated to follow that order? Well, yes. I mean, that really is interfering with a police officer. But before, and still, until we pass this law, there was this thought that the officer could just tell you what to do, even if you were engaging in a constitutionally protected activity. And it was abused. Not all the time, but there were officers who abused it, who said, you know, I don't like what you're saying, so you have to leave, but I'm going to let these other protesters stay because I like what they're saying, you know. So you'd see examples where officers would use that authority to, you know, favor one viewpoint over another. Now, was that the rule? No, but I think that's something we definitely needed to correct, and we are. So, I mean, we're not completely eliminating interfering with a police officer. Obviously, if you interfere with a police officer in the performance of their duty, then yes, you're going to be charged with interfering with a police officer. But we're trying to eliminate it as sort of a standalone offense, except in those circumstances where somebody actually is interfering with a police officer and not just, you know, engaging in constitutionally protected activity. So,
Yeah,
Dawn,
Sean
do you have
Shivers
anything?
here. I've got another answer. Mine's a lot fuzzier than yours, Marty. And I don't think the cops are ever the boss, right? The community hires them and charges them with upholding our standards. The community, at the end of the day, is the boss. And where we run into trouble is when some parts of the community disagree with other parts. So that's a conversation that we need to have as a community in order to direct our officers in a way that it's clear what they should be doing and how they should be upholding community values. It's a whole lot fuzzier, and you know, when you are doing something, when an officer tells you to do something, my you know, not legal advice is to avoid trouble and, you know, get out of the way. But at the end of the day, the reason we have the auditor and the civilian review board and the police commission are to help direct the officer in how to serve the community better.
Michael?
I'm good. I think I've talked a bunch.
Okay. Our next question is from Scott Coltrane, City Club President.
So this question is for all three panelists. Can you talk more about trauma-informed training and what research tells us about different models or best practices? Specifically, what are the challenges and opportunities of relying on police officers for intervention versus calling in other mental health professionals?
I guess I'll just give some examples. I mean, I used to be a domestic violence prosecutor up in Lynn County, and one of the things I quickly discovered is survivors of domestic violence often do not act in ways that I would act, or I believe I would act in the same circumstance. And so one of the things that hopefully made me a better prosecutor over time is, as I learned, you know, what the trauma of going through that experience can do to someone, help me understand them better and you know, work with them as opposed to thinking that somehow they were wrong because they didn't act the way I would have in that. Trauma-informed policing and trauma-informed practices more generally is just being aware of that, trying to appreciate where someone is coming from and how it might inform their viewpoint. So, I mean, there's the recent shooting in Portland. So there was someone who was mentally ill. He was playing with what ended up being a toy gun, and, you know, disturbing people. And he ended up getting shot. And I don't think we know all the facts, but I think we can all agree it's a tragedy. And the question is there, you know, in retrospect, can we think of ways that we can handle that situation better in the future? I think the Brian Babb case in Eugene is another example of somebody who we knew was going through a crisis. We had his counselor on the phone with the police, and you know, there were actions that escalated that, and then through a series of happenstances, his counselor was disconnected. You know, the trauma-informed thing to do would be to keep the counselor on the line and not escalate the situation, right? But at the end of the day, he ended up getting shot. So I guess it's trying to bring the right tool to the right situation and appreciate that people might be coming from a different perspective. I think, as Mary pointed out, you know, when sees a police officer, she does not necessarily view that as an unwelcome interaction. But if you grew up Black or Hispanic in certain parts of this country, you might have a different attitude about the police, and it might be because you had some specific trauma related to them. And so, if I'm a police officer and I'm approaching somebody, I think I need to be aware of that and think about how, the total situation. What is the overall picture? If I'm giving a ticket, where does that fall in the spectrum of things that need to happen for everybody to leave this situation safely? And how might somebody perceive me in that situation? So I'm not an expert on, field policing myself, but I just wanted to give a personal experience of how my own perceptions changed as I became more aware of trauma-informed practices.
Sean?
Let's go with Michael first, I think.
Michael?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you, Scott. This is Michael. And I've taught around this issue before in my classes, and so Oregon has an excellent example of unintended consequences in criminal justice reform around our mandatory arrest law. I believe that the state of Oregon has the oldest mandatory arrest law, which essentially states that if there is some kind of assault or violence that happens in a domestic space, it doesn't have to be husband and wife or partner and partner, it could be some other combination. Police arriving on the scene have to identify who they believe is the primary aggressor, and they have to make an arrest. They can arrest both if they can't determine if both people are being violent and they can't determine who's the primary aggressor, but they have to arrest someone. And we can all understand why this was thought to be an important reform. But what's ended up happening is that a lot of women who are defending themselves at the point where the police arrive end up being arrested. That creates all kinds of complications then for child custody. The other thing that happens is that it creates a scenario where many women are more reluctant to report domestic violence because this is someone they love. They don't want to see, this is perhaps the father of their child. They don't want to see them go to prison. And so there's this ironically, the one thing that this law has done is it's reduced the number of batterers who are murdered, who are killed by their partners, but it has not actually had a measurable impact on domestic violence. And so, but it also creates a scenario where police arrive, they're going to make an arrest because they're required to by law. And so that automatically makes it a more dangerous situation, both for the law enforcement officers and for everyone else, because if you're arresting someone, there's more likelihood that there'll be resistance. There's more likelihood that perhaps you're arresting the husband and the female partner might attack the police officer. That happens. And so I think the promise, I hope, of trauma-informed responses to these sorts of scenarios is that there might be a better understanding, as Representative Wild was saying, there might be a better understanding of what people are going through, where they're at. Perhaps, I mean, we still have the limitations of this law, which most feminist legal scholars that I know think is a bad law, although wonderfully intended. And so we need to find better ways, I think, all around of dealing with violence, substance abuse, et cetera. And I believe that, from what I understand about trauma-informed responses, that's one of the things they're trying to do. I was also going to say a little bit. So there's a sense that that these on the part of police, that these sorts of calls are the most dangerous ones that they go into, and that's part of what leads to an aggressive, or not aggressive perhaps, but overly cautious mindset, right? That they're going into a dangerous scenario when they respond to a domestic violence call, or to someone who's mentally ill, or even a traffic stop. Actually, the most dangerous thing that patrol officers do is serve warrants. But these other scenarios might not be as dangerous if police were able to respond, or if some other entity like Cahoots in Eugene were responding with a more trauma-informed scenario, without the guns, without the military style uniform, without the loud booming voice, right? All of those things that police culture tends to inculcate, I think are trauma-inducing for a lot of people rather than trauma-reducing.
Sean, we have about a minute left.
So when it comes to trauma-informed care, there's a variety of types of trauma involved in these situations and a variety of triggers, right? So like Michael was saying, a loud, booming male voice can be a trauma trigger for folks that then act less rationally. You asked also about the types of calls in which it's appropriate for police to respond and which types aren't, particularly in the context of trauma-informed care. And I think the Cahoots model is incredibly effective. Unfortunately, the realities of dangerous situations and the Cahoots model is such that, if somebody's got a weapon, the Cahoots folks are not able to respond to that. So the police have to step in, even if there's a trauma involved, even if trauma is the reason that somebody's acting irrationally. If they're a particular level, if they're seen as being a particular level of dangerous, the police have to respond nonetheless. And who we see as dangerous is also a huge area of concern and something we need to look at pretty carefully. But at the end of the day, I also want to talk about the traumas that the police officers have to go through, that we as a society expect them to go through, and the types of health that we offer them as a response. Because it's not just that folks will act what I would consider less rationally when they are triggered a particular way, but officers go through quite a lot of trauma and can also exhibit some of those behaviors of being triggered by a suspect's or interactions response as well, which I think is a huge part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, all of you, for a wonderful program.
This has been our April 23rd, 2021 program, Oregon Legislature Tackles Equity in Policing. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, UO has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. I would also like to acknowledge our gold sponsors, Hirschner Hunter Attorneys, LLP, and Homes for Good, and our Sapphire sponsor, Summit Bank, an independent community bank headquartered in Eugene. Summit Bank serves businesses and professionals in Eugene, Springfield, and Central Oregon communities. For more information, visit sbko.bank. Before we thank our speakers today, I have a few more quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, and Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you to public radio station KLCC FM 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. If you're a City Club of Eugene member, you can ask a question at future tapings of our programs. If you are not yet a member, you can join and then participate. More information is on our website. For our program next week, the City Club of Eugene will present Seeing the Forest for the Trees, the Emerald Valley's Urban Forest. More details and information about future programs can be found online at cityclubofeugene.org. A programming note: today's program was recorded before a verdict was rendered in the Derek Chauvin case, so it was not discussed. Now, I would like to thank today's speakers for a great program. Marty Wilde, Sean Shivers, and Michael Haynes-Garcia, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on this important topic. This concludes today's program. Be well and stay safe.